September 1951. Resort town of Deal, New Jersey, 180 Ocean Avenue. The air over the Atlantic coast is filled not with salty breeze but with acrid dust of crushed limestone and plaster. Arnold Wrecking Company's heavy machinery is working on the site. The crew's task is simple: destroy the object local residents called a palace. But the work progresses slowly. The walls turn out so sturdy that regular demolition turns into a 7-week siege. Workers break sledgehammers against steel beams hidden inside Italian marble. This isn't just a building's demolition. This is a gigantic financial empire's body dissection. Under the cast iron ball's blows, the Raymer Mansion collapses. 19 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms with gold-plated plumbing, the grand staircase up which the 20th century's most influential people ascended. Now, it's a pile of construction debris valued at $111,000. The stone crumbles with the same sound with which 30 years earlier its owner's fortune collapsed. The man who built this castle was named William Croppo Durant. In business circles, he was known as Billy, the man who not only created America's automotive industry but invented the very concept of the giant corporation. General Motors founder, Chevrolet creator, a titan whose personal fortune adjusted to modern rates would exceed billions of dollars. But at the moment, when the excavator tears his former home's foundation from the ground, Billy Durant himself is no longer alive. He died 4 years before this demolition, deprived of his empire, his influence, and his home. The mansion's destruction scene in 1951 is merely an echo of the real catastrophe that occurred much earlier. To understand this collapse's nature, we need to go back 15 years to the federal courtroom. February 8, 1936, New York. A 74-year-old man stands before the judge. He's dressed neatly, but his suit is no longer new. In his hands, he holds a voluntary bankruptcy document. The figures in this document look like a typist's error, but they're absolutely real. In the liabilities column, the amount of $914,000 is indicated. These are debts to creditors, lawyers, and former partners. The judge's gaze drops lower to the assets column. There's only one word written: clothing. Assets value is estimated at $250. This is all that remains of the man who twice took control of the world's largest industrial company. $250. No stocks, no real estate, no hidden accounts in Switzerland. William Durant, the man who effectively put America on wheels, is officially declared insolvent. The contrast between the Raymer Mansion's ruins and the bankrupt's asset list creates a frightening picture. This isn't a story about bad investments. This is a story about pathological ambition that first builds palaces to the skies and then grinds their owners into dust. Durant wasn't circumstance's victim. He was his own rise's architect, and much more importantly, his own fall's chief engineer. While workers in New Jersey load marble debris into dump trucks, historical records reveal another scene to us. 1920, Powers Peak. Durant buys this house in Deal to turn it into a summer residence for the automotive world's kings. He pays in cash. He hires the best decorators. He's confident this foundation will stand forever. He's wrong. The Raymer Mansion's foundation was poured not with concrete, but with stock market speculations. Every column in this house rested on risky loans. Every party held in these halls was paid for with money that technically no longer existed. The house's demolition in 1951 is a belated reckoning for decisions made in 1920. Billy Durant's story isn't a typical success biography. It's grand failure's anatomy. It's a thriller about how a man can control half of the U.S. automotive market and end his life managing a bowling club in the provincial town of Flint. But before the walls collapse and bailiffs inventory the property, we must go back to the beginning, to where ambition hadn't yet become poison, to where Michigan governor's grandson decided that simple wealth wasn't enough for him. He wanted to change human movement's physical reality across the planet. William Crapo Durant was born on December 8, 1861 in Boston. But his fate was forged in Michigan's forests. To understand why this man would buy the Raymer Mansion and destroy his life in a monopoly's pursuit, we need to look at his blood. He wasn't a hungry immigrant grasping at any opportunity. He was Henry Howland Crapo's grandson, Michigan's state governor, and lumber magnate. Durant grew up in an environment where money wasn't a goal, but a tool as commonplace as silverware. But in this golden cradle there was a crack. His father was an alcoholic and a bankrupt who abandoned the family. This early lesson shaped in young Billy a paradoxical psychology. He had access to the elite, but he was panic-stricken, afraid of poverty. He dropped out of school to work in his grandfather's lumberyard shifting planks. By day, he worked with his hands, and at night, he learned to sell. It was then in the late 1870s that Durant discovered in himself a supernatural gift. He could convince anyone to buy anything. He sold cigars, insurance, land. He wasn't selling a product. He was selling confidence. The turning point came one evening in September 1886. 24-year-old Durant was walking down the street in Coldwater, Michigan. His attention was drawn to a horse-drawn carriage of unusual design, a light, two-wheeled cart that moved remarkably smoothly over a rutted road. Durant stopped the driver. He learned the smooth ride's secret lay in a patented spring suspension. That same night, Billy Durant made a decision that would define his business style for the next 60 years. He didn't haggle over a single carriage. He went to the inventor and bought the patent and production rights for $50. He didn't have that money. He didn't have a factory. He didn't have manufacturing experience, but he saw a market where others saw just a cart. Returning to Flint, he borrowed $2,000 from a local bank using only his name and charisma and founded the Durant Dort Carriage Company with his friend Josiah Dallas Dort. This was his philosophy's first demonstration. Sell first, build later. Durant went to an agricultural fair with a prototype cart. In a few days, he received orders for 600 units. He still didn't have a factory. He hired contractors to fulfill the orders and used the prepayments for expansion. It was a scheme bordering on adventure, but it worked. By the 20th century's beginning, the Durant Dort Company had become the United States' largest producer of horse-drawn carriages. They produced 50,000 carts yearly. Flint, Michigan, earned the nickname City of Vehicles thanks to Durant long before the first automobile appeared on its streets. By age 40, Billy Durant was a multi-millionaire. His fortune was estimated in millions of dollars of that time, which today would equal hundreds of millions. He created a vertically integrated empire. He owned forests for timber, factories for producing varnish, workshops for making wheels. He controlled every stage from raw materials to sales. And here lies his life's greatest irony. the man who would become the American auto industry's face, hated automobiles. In 1901, Durant was automobiles' fierce opponent. He considered them noisy, smelly, and dangerous toys for rich idlers. When his daughter wanted to take a ride in an automobile, he forbade her, stating it was too risky. He even publicly advocated banning automobiles from public roads. This wasn't conservatism, this was pragmatism. His business was built on horses. Automobiles threatened his empire. But Durant possessed a quality that distinguished him from other magnates of that time. He lacked sentimentality. He could change his opinion instantly if he saw the numbers. In fall 1904, the owners of a tiny dying company called Buick approached him. The company was in debt. Its founder, David Buick, was a brilliant engineer, but a terrible businessman. They'd produced only 37 automobiles. Durant agreed to look at the car only out of politeness. Test drive took place in November 1904. Durant got into the Buick Model B and drove through Flint's outskirts, mud and ruts. For 2 months, he tested the car in the harshest conditions. And something clicked in his head. He didn't see a car. He saw what he'd seen in that car 18 years earlier, scaling potential. He realized the automobile wasn't a horse replacement. It was a time replacement. It was speed. It was the future. On November 1st, 1904, Durant took control of the Buick Motor Company. His strategy was aggressive and frightening. At the 1905 New York Auto Show, he ordered the Buick disassembled and the chassis and engine displayed separately to prove the design's reliability. And then he did what he did best. He began selling stock. Durant wasn't just building cars. He was building a financial structure. He traveled to small Michigan towns selling Buick stock to local doctors, lawyers, and shopkeepers. He promised them golden mountains, and unlike swindlers, he kept his promises. In 4 years, he turned Buick from a bankrupt into America's best-selling automaker, surpassing even Ford. The company's capitalization grew from $75,000 to $1.5 million. But one brand wasn't enough for Durant. His mind worked differently from Henry Ford's. Ford wanted to create one perfect car for everyone, the Model T. Durant, however, understood human psychology more deeply. He knew people wanted variety. One wants a cheap car, another a powerful one, the third a luxurious one. He decided to create a corporation that would sell a car for every wallet and every purpose. His idea was revolutionary, a holding company uniting numerous different brands under one roof. This reduced risks. If one brand failed, another would pull the company through. In 1908, he registered a company with a neutral, almost bureaucratic name, General Motors. At this moment, a dangerous trait in his character emerged, one that would later lead to the Raymer Mansion's collapse. Durant didn't know how to stop. He began buying up automobile companies wholesale: Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland, Future Pontiac. He bought them, often without even looking at the accounting books, relying on intuition. He bought a company that produced lamps, a company that made speedometers. At one point, he even tried to buy Ford Motor Company for $8 million, but the bankers refused him credit. Durant was energy's volcano. He worked 20 hours daily, managing the empire by phone from hotel rooms. He kept no records, holding all the numbers in his head. His desk was clean, but chaos reigned in his mind. He was expansion's genius, but management's catastrophe. By 1910, General Motors produced 1/5 of all automobiles in the USA. but the company had run out of cash. Durant had overestimated his strength. He'd accumulated too much debt buying unprofitable factories. The Wall Street bankers, who'd always looked at the upstart from Michigan with suspicion, saw their chance. In September 1910, a banking syndicate agreed to save General Motors from bankruptcy on one condition: William Durant must leave. He was ousted from the company he'd created. He was 49 years old, humiliated, stripped of power, but still rich. Most people in his place would have retired, bought a yacht, and lived on dividends. But Durant wasn't most people. The same fire burned in his eyes as at 18 years old. He wasn't going to give up. He was going to take revenge, and his revenge's instrument would be a Swiss racer named Louis Chevrolet. On November 3, 1911, in Detroit, a document was signed that became the instrument of history's most intricate corporate revenge. William Durant, ousted from his own empire, didn't retreat into the shadows. He found a partner who was his complete opposite. Louis Chevrolet was a large, burly Swiss racer with thick mustaches and a perpetual cigarette between his teeth. He barely spoke English, but he understood engines' language better than anyone on the continent. Durant saw in him not just an engineer, but a name that sounded like music, like speed, like victory. The alliance of Durant and Chevrolet was convenience's marriage, where each tried to use the other. Louis dreamed of creating refined, expensive automobiles for the elite, capable of enormous speeds. Durant nodded, smiled, but kept a completely different plan in his head. He didn't need a toy for the rich. He needed a Ford killer. While Louis worked on luxury cars prototypes, Durant secretly prepared to release a model that was supposed to cost less than $500. Conflict was inevitable. In 1913, returning from vacation, Louis Chevrolet discovered Durant had repurposed the factory for producing cheap, mass-market automobiles. Offended in his best feelings, the racer made business history's most expensive mistake. He sold his stake to Durant for a couple dozen thousand and left, leaving the partner with only one thing: the right to use his surname. Louis Chevrolet would die in poverty, working as a mechanic at the factory that bore his name. Durant, however, would turn that name into a gold mine. By 1915, the new Chevrolet Motorcar Company had become a phenomenon. The Model 490, named for its price of $490, flew off the shelves like hotcakes. Profits flowed like a river. And here, Durant began implementing his grand plan, which Wall Street considered impossible. He didn't spend profits on yachts. He didn't buy islands. He began secretly buying up General Motors shares. This was Operation Mouse Eats Elephant. Durant offered General Motors shareholders to exchange their papers for the fast-growing Chevrolet shares with an incredibly favorable ratio: 5 Chevrolet shares for 1 General Motors share. Brokers and investors, seeing Chevrolet's explosive growth and GM's stagnation under the banker's management, agreed. On September 16, 1916, an event occurred that entered history textbooks: the annual General Motors shareholders' meeting. The bankers who'd shamefully ousted Durant 6 years earlier sat at the head of the table, confident in their control. The door opened and Billy Durant entered. He was calm. Behind him stood Pierre DuPont, head of the chemical giant DuPont and one of America's richest men. Durant approached the table and uttered a phrase that brought silence to the room. "Gentlemen, I now control this company." He laid out documents on the table confirming the tiny Chevrolet company now owned the controlling stake in the giant General Motors. It was triumph. The bankers were defeated by their own weapon, shareholder capital. Durant reclaimed his crown, and Chevrolet became part of the General Motors concern. To cement this success and give it weight, Durant forged a strategic alliance with the DuPont clan. Pierre DuPont, a man of old money, conservative, cold, and calculating, became chairman of the board. It was two worlds' merger, Durant's explosive, risky energy and the icy, centuries-old stability of the DuPonts. It seemed this structure would stand forever. Shares soared to the skies. Durant's personal fortune exceeded $100 million of that time. It was at this moment of absolute triumph, when the whole world lay at his feet, that Durant decided he needed a home befitting his status as emperor. He felt cramped in Michigan's industrial cities. His gaze turned east to the Atlantic coast. He chose not just a place, he chose a symbol. The town of Deal in New Jersey in the 1920s was a closed club for the elite, a place where old aristocracy mingled with new industrial magnates. There were no random people here. Land here cost more than on Manhattan. It was here on a high shore with an ocean view that Durant found what he was looking for. In 1920, when General Motors shares were trading at historic highs, Durant buys one of the coast's most expensive plots, 180 Ocean Avenue, the estate which would soon be named Raymer. This house's purchase wasn't just real estate acquisition, it was a manifesto. Durant, who'd lived his whole life in trains and hotels, who managed his empire by phone, suddenly decided to put down roots. He wanted to create success's monument. Raymer was to become victory's physical embodiment over the bankers, over his father's poverty, over the critics' doubts. This was the moment when caution finally left him. Durant began spending money at the same speed at which it came. He didn't hire one architect. He hired decorators' army. He didn't buy furniture. He bought collections. The house in Deal was to become a place where politicians, industrialists, and silent film stars' paths converged. But in this grandeur, the threat was already lurking. Raymer's construction and furnishing began exactly at the moment when the U.S. economy began showing overheating's first signs after World War I. While Durant was choosing Italian marble for the hall, storm clouds were beginning to gather on the stock exchanges. The contrast was striking. On the construction site in New Jersey, they were erecting walls a meter thick to stand for centuries, while Durant's financial empire's foundation, built on speculations and leveraged credit, was becoming thinner and more transparent. The alliance with the DuPonts, which was supposed to be insurance, turned out to be a trap in reality. Old money doesn't like risk. Pierre DuPont watched his partner's spending and management style with growing anxiety. While Durant was planning where to place the grand piano in the new living room, DuPont was already calculating options to protect his investments in case of collapse. Raymer was becoming reality. Snow-white walls rose above the ocean, challenging the elements. Durant, standing on the still unfinished house's terrace, felt like a god. He didn't know this house would become not a family nest, but a golden cage, and that it was here, amid luxury and grandeur, that he'd experience his life's darkest days. He was building a palace for a king, but history was already preparing the scenery for the fool's fall. To understand how a man loses $90 million in 6 months, one must first see the scenery in which this spectacle was played out. The Raymer Mansion, located at 180 Ocean Avenue, wasn't just a house. It was a psychological cast of William Durant's consciousness, frozen in stone and plaster. If the factories in Michigan were his hands, then this house in New Jersey was his ego. The first thing that caught anyone's eye approaching the gates in 1920 was the space's aggressive openness. The house didn't hide behind high fences. It stood on an elevation facing the Atlantic Ocean as if challenging the elements to a duel. The snow-white facade in Italian Renaissance style, covered with red tiles, shone in the sun so brightly it hurt to look at it. It was the architectural equivalent of Durant's dazzling smile with which he disarmed investors. Inside the mansion, the visitor was greeted not by coziness, but by scale. The main hall was designed so a person felt small. Floors of rare marble brought from Europe reflected the crystal chandelier's light like a mirror. But attraction's center was the staircase, grandiose, bifurcating, with wrought iron railings of intricate workmanship. It was created not just to go up to the second floor. It was created for ceremonial entrances. Durant, despite his short stature, loved to look down on the world, and this architecture gave him that opportunity. Let us mentally walk through this space. 19 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms. The numbers here are critically important. 19 bedrooms for a family that effectively consisted of 3 people. No, this was a building not for living, but for an entourage. Durant was never alone. He was always surrounded by secretaries, assistants, stockbrokers, supplicants, and partners. Raymer was designed as a field commander's headquarters. Each guest room was luxurious but impersonal, reminiscent of rooms in the best Paris hotels. This was a hint. Your guests here, and your stay depends on the host's favor. The library occupied a special place in the house. But unlike the DuPont's or Morgan's libraries, where walls were lined with ancient folios, here books served more as texture than knowledge's source. It was a negotiation room. Massive oak tables, heavy leather armchairs, expensive cigar smell. It was here in smoke clouds that Detroit factories' fates were decided. This room's walls heard more numbers than words. Here, Durant, pacing from corner to corner, he could never sit still for long, drew merger and acquisition schemes. In the air, Durant's psychology manifested itself in details only the most attentive noticed. Windows, huge panoramic windows facing the ocean. Durant hated enclosed spaces. He needed the horizon. He needed to see perspective. In this house, there were practically no dark corners. Everything was flooded with light. This was his business's metaphor. He believed in infinite growth, in a bright future, ignoring the shadows already gathering behind him. In the dining room, capable of seating 40 people, table setting turned into a ritual. Porcelain with gold rims, silverware with monograms. But the paradox was Durant himself often ate quickly and simply. Luxury wasn't needed for him personally. It was needed for demonstrating power. When he hosted Walter Chrysler or Alfred Sloan here, every fork, every wall painting, every velvet curtain screamed, quote one, servants in the house, and there was a whole staff. Moved silently, like a well-oiled mechanism's parts, Durant demanded perfect efficiency. If he rang the bell, the response had to be instant. The house worked like a factory producing comfort, but behind this perfect order, facade hid chaos. In Durant's office stood several telephones. They rang continuously. connection to the New York Stock Exchange, connection to Flint, connection to Washington. Raymer wasn't a rest place, but a control tower from which Durant tried to manage the hurricane. The music room is also interesting. An organ was installed in the house. Music sounds often filled these huge halls, creating an almost church-like atmosphere. Durant, sitting in an armchair and listening to music, could disconnect from reality for minutes. These were rare silence moments in his head. But even these moments were paid for with borrowed money. The contrast between Raymer and the outside world in 1920 was striking. While the country experienced post-war inflation, strikes, and social tension, here in deal time seemed to have stopped in an eternal celebration. Durant's neighbors were the Guggenheims and Rockefellers, but their houses were old money fortresses built for centuries. Durant's house, for all its beauty, seemed like a set built overnight. It had a certain temporariness, fragility characteristic of things bought at a speculative bubble's peak. The masters who created Raymer's interiors used the best materials: mahogany, Italian travertine, French silk. But they couldn't imbue this house with history it didn't have. It was a palace without a dynasty. There were no portraits of ancestors in armor hanging in the corridors. There hung landscapes bought at auctions. It was the home of a self-made man who tried to buy himself a past he didn't have. And most importantly, the view from the terrace. Standing there on the cliff's edge, Durant saw the endless ocean. Waves crashed against the rocks with a roar resembling applause. In early 1920, when General Motors stock prices reached their peak, Durant must have felt he controlled even these waves. He didn't know the ocean wasn't his power's metaphor, but a harbinger of his fate. Water, like the market, doesn't forgive mistakes. It can lift to the crest or smash against the rocks. Raymer's walls were sturdy. The foundation was deep. But the house stood on stock quotes, shifting ground. Every brick in this building was effectively pawned. While guests drank champagne in the living room and danced in the ballroom, the telegraph machines in the owner's office were already tapping out alarming messages. The air smelled not only of expensive perfumes and sea salt, the air smelled of ozone before a storm. Summer 1920 was coming to an end. The U.S. economy was preparing for a sharp slowdown, and this white marble palace, which was to become William Durant's eternal success monument, would turn into financial warfare history's most expensive bunker just a few months later. Remember this image: a shining chandelier reflected in polished marble, guests' laughter, the host's confident voice. Remember, because this is the last scene before the catastrophe. In the next room we enter, the light will go out. Fall, 1920. The wind from the Atlantic turns icy, and silence settles in the Raymer Mansion's corridors. Telephones, which previously rang off the hook with merger proposals, now ring for one purpose only. These are brokers, and they have only one message for William Durant: margin call. Here begins the human tragedy that turns a success story into an ancient drama. Durant wasn't a swindler who ran off with investors' money. His sin was worse. He sincerely believed in his own omnipotence. When General Motors shares began to fall amid the post-war recession, Durant took it as a personal insult. He decided to fight the market itself. While other magnates, such as Rockefeller or Morgan, went into cash during crisis and waited out the storm, Billy Durant began buying. He opened what was called a support account. Every time the stock price fell by $1, he bought thousands of shares to hold the price. He did it not to make money. He did it because thousands of ordinary people, his friends in Flint, his employees, shopkeepers who believed in him, had invested their savings in General Motors. He felt like a messiah obliged to save their money. In this struggle, there's dark irony. The creator of the world's greatest corporation sat in his palace's library in New Jersey and borrowed money at usurious rates to buy shares of his own company, which the market considered overvalued. He pawned everything, his shares, his future income, and ultimately his house. Here enters Catherine Durant, his second wife. In stories about great magnates, women often remain in the shadows, playing a decorative role. But Catherine becomes a silent witness to the collapse. She sees her husband, always energetic and glowing with optimism, turn into a hunted animal. She signs papers without reading. She takes jewelry from the safe, pearl necklaces, diamonds, everything that was their status symbol, goes to the pawn shop to pay for another day of fighting for the stock price. This is truth's moment. Raymer's gold flakes off, revealing despair's steel frame. By November 1920, the situation becomes catastrophic. Durant's debt to brokers reaches an unimaginable figure, about $30 million of that time. In today's equivalent, that's hundreds of millions, but the scariest thing isn't the amount. The scariest thing is he hid the disaster's scale from his partners. Moral ambivalence reaches its peak. Is Durant a hero who sacrifices everything for investors, or a madman who puts a national industry's existence at risk for his ego? The denouement comes on November 18, 1920. It doesn't happen in a courtroom or on a battlefield. It happens in a quiet office. Pierre Dupont, chairman of the board and former ally, calls an emergency meeting. With him are J.P. Morgan bank representatives. They learned about Durant's debts. They realized that if Billy declares bankruptcy, his shares will be dumped on the market and General Motors will collapse following its creator. This meeting scene is worthy of Shakespeare's pen. On one side of the table, Pierre Dupont, cold, calculating, a man of numbers and logic. He doesn't raise his voice. He simply states the fact. Durant is bankrupt. On the other side, Billy Durant, a man of chaos and dreams. He's tired, cornered, but still trying to smile. DuPont and the bankers offer a deal. They'll pay off Durant's personal debts to prevent panic on the exchange. They'll create a special company to buy out his shares. He won't be left penniless. But this salvation's price is his crown. Durant must step down as General Motors president forever, without the right to return. Durant looks at the people he made rich. He looks at the company he assembled from scattered workshops, and he agrees. At that moment, he loses not money. He loses life's meaning. On November 30th, 1920, he exits the General Motors building in Detroit. He carries a briefcase with personal belongings in his hands. Witnesses say he looked calm, even whistling a tune. But it was a dead man's calm. When he returns to Raymer, the house changes its essence. It's no longer an emperor's palace. It's a golden cage in which a deposed king is locked. Luxurious halls created for hundreds of guests' receptions now seem frighteningly empty. Footsteps echo in the marble hall sounds like a verdict. Here lies the deepest psychological conflict. Durant saved face before the public, but inside he was broken. He saved his investor friends from instant collapse by taking the blow himself. But he lost his brainchild. Can this be called victory? Hardly. It was a sacrifice no one appreciated. The man who built the industry is thrown out of it by people who knew only how to count money but didn't know how to dream. DuPont and Sloan are management geniuses. They'll make General Motors the world's greatest company, but they'll do it on the foundation Billy Durant poured with his blood and money. The Raymer Mansion in this period becomes ghostly life's place. Durant is still rich by ordinary standards. He has some assets left, his wife by his side, but he lost his main toy. And like any addicted gambler, he cannot simply stop. In his head, in the library's silence with an ocean view, a new plan is already beginning to take shape, a plan that's supposed to return him to greatness, but which will ultimately lead to final destruction. He decides he can repeat success. He thinks, quote 2, he doesn't yet know the era of lone romantics is over. The era of corporate bureaucrats has begun. And in this new era, there's no place for Billy Durant. The drama's fifth part ends not with an explosion, but with a resignation paper signing. But it's precisely this pen stroke that starts the clockwork that 16 years later will lead to that very courtroom scene with $250 in his pocket. Durant leaves General Motors, but he takes his pride with him. And this pride will become the battering ram that shatters his life's remnants to pieces and turns the marble palace of Raymer into ruins. We leave Durant on his house's terrace at 1920's end. He looks at the ocean. He's just lost $90 million, but there are no tears in his eyes. A new, feverish fire is already burning in them, a fire that will burn everything to ashes. Early 1921. One would think William Durant's story should have ended with his exile, but his nature's tragedy lay in his inability to accept the finale. He couldn't sit in the Raymer Mansion's silence and listen to the surf's sound. Silence was killing him. He needed factories hum. Just 6 weeks after losing General Motors, Durant announces a new company's creation, Durant Motors. This was an act of incredible, almost pathological stubbornness. He had no factories, no blueprints, no team. He had only his name, and that proved sufficient. In 48 hours, he raised $5 million from ordinary investors. People believed in Billy's magic. They remembered how he turned $100 into millions with Buick. They brought him their savings, mortgaging homes, selling jewelry. But the Durant of the 1920s was no longer the visionary who created the industry. This was a man obsessed with revenge. He tries to build a shadow General Motors. He launches the Star brand to kill Ford. He launches Durant to kill Buick. He launches Locomobile to kill Cadillac. In these years, the Raymer Mansion experiences its last feverish flowering, receptions again, champagne again. But the atmosphere has changed. Now it's not success's celebration, but a facade designed to hide the rotting foundation. Durant manages the new empire just as he did the old one. Chaos, intuition, stock market games. But the market has changed. Professional managers have arrived. Alfred Sloan at General Motors is building a system against which a lone individual's intuition is powerless. Durant Motors begins to crack at the seams even before the Great Depression. But the real blow which will turn the marble palace into a tomb is struck in October 1929. The Wall Street crash, Black Tuesday. At this moment, Durant makes his final fatal mistake. Together with Rockefeller family members and other magnates, he tries to do the impossible, stop the market's fall with his own money. He pours millions into buying shares, trying to create an artificial bottom. It was like trying to stop a tsunami with bare hands. The market swallowed his fortune and didn't even notice. By 1930, nothing remained of the $100 million fortune. Durant Motors is liquidated. Investors lose everything. And then comes the silence he feared so much. The Raymer mansion in the 1930s turns into a ghost. There's no more money to maintain servant staff. Huge halls become covered in dust. The garden, which required a dozen gardeners' work, overgrows with weeds. Electricity is turned off for non-payment. Durant and his wife Catherine live in a few rooms of the huge cold palace, moving with candles like the past's shadows. This is the crisis's scariest period. This isn't just money's loss. This is identity's loss. Who is Billy Durant without his factories? Who is he without his checkbook? In 1936, during that very bankruptcy trial, something amazing happens. When the judge asks him about the collapse's reasons, Durant doesn't blame the bankers, doesn't blame the market, doesn't blame the traders. He simply says, quote 3, he leaves the courtroom with $250 in his pocket, but without the past's burden. And here begins the transformation that makes this story great. Having lost everything, Durant gains freedom. In 1940, at age 78, the former auto industry emperor opens a new establishment in Flint. It's not an automobile factory. It's not a bank. It's a bowling club with a snack bar named North Flint Recreation. Imagine this picture. The man who owned the Raymer Castle with 19 bedrooms now stands behind the counter and fries hamburgers. He personally hands out bowling shoes. He sweeps the floor. It seems like rock bottom. This is humiliation. But witnesses from those years describe something completely different. They say they'd never seen Billy Durant so happy. In the bowling alley, he finally found what he lacked in Raymer's golden halls: live human communication without masks. People came not to a millionaire from whom they needed something. They came to old Billy to roll balls and eat a sandwich. He talked with young workers from General Motors factories he himself had built, and listened to their stories. He gave advice. He laughed. The moment's transcendence lies in success's concept, complete rethinking. Durant realized his legacy isn't money in the account and not marble walls in New Jersey. His legacy is Flint City, which lives and breathes. It's thousands of people who have jobs. It's automobiles that change the world. He didn't need to own General Motors to be its father. The Raymer mansion at that time no longer belonged to him. It was seized for debts and sold at auction in 1938 for a pittance. The new owner never moved in. The house stood empty, slowly deteriorating under the Atlantic winds, symbolizing an era that had passed irrevocably. It was ambition's monument detached from reality. And the bowling alley in Flint was a living organism full of laughter, pins clatter, and coffee smell. Durant chose life, not a monument. In 1942, Durant suffers a stroke. He's bedridden in a small Flint apartment. By his side is only his faithful Catherine. Money for his treatment and maintenance is secretly provided by Alfred Sloan, Walter Chrysler, and Pierre DuPont. Those very people who ousted him from the business created a private fund so their old enemy and teacher wouldn't die in poverty. It was Highest Recognitions Act. They knew without Durant's madness, there'd be no their rational success. Lying in bed, half paralyzed, Durant didn't rave about lost millions. He didn't recall Raymer's chandeliers. He asked to bring him news summaries about automobile production. Until his last breath, he was interested in how the world he'd propelled forward was moving. The crisis destroyed his financial shell but exposed his human essence. He ceased to be the king and became simply Billy. And in this fall, there was more greatness than in all his rises. The Raymer Mansion was built to rise above people. The bowling alley was built to be among them. At his life's end, Durant understood which of these buildings was the real home. But history knows no subjunctive mood. Durant died, and his castle remained standing on the ocean shore, awaiting its execution. The owner's death in 1947 became the signal. A house without a soul cannot exist for long. Raymer's physical destruction became only a matter of time. In fall 1951, the dust over the lot at 180 Ocean Avenue finally settled. The 7-week siege that Arnold Wrecking Company waged against William Durant's marble legacy ended in architecture's complete capitulation. What was built as eternity's monument was hauled to the dump in dirty trucks' beds. From the Raymer Mansion, only a flat plot of land remained, exposed to icy winds from the Atlantic. Not a single wall, not a single column, not a single stained glass window. Absolute ringing emptiness. In this physical disappearance lies this story's last and cruelest lesson. Durant's house destruction occurred 4 years after Durant's own death, and in this temporal gap lies profound symbolism. The material world for which Billy clung so desperately, stocks, mansions, gold, proved to be his legacy's most fragile element. Stone turned into sand, but the idea he gave birth to in his mind's chaos proved stronger than any steel. While excavators were smashing walls in New Jersey, something incredible was happening on America's roads. Millions of automobiles with Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac emblems were carrying families to new homes. The General Motors Corporation, which Durant created on a paper scrap and lost twice, by the mid-1950s became human history's first company to earn $1 billion in net profit in a year. This is Billy Durant's legacy's greatest paradox. He died a bankrupt, but left behind industrial history's richest inheritance. We're accustomed to measuring success by bank account size at death's moment. By this logic, Durant was a failure with $250 in his pocket. But if greatness is measured by how much the world changed thanks to a person, then Durant stands above Rockefeller. Rockefeller simply pumped oil. Durant created the reason why that oil was needed. The Raymer Mansion story today sounds like a grim warning to modern Silicon Valley titans. We see the same patterns: explosive growth, construction of giant futuristic campuses, belief in infinite scaling. Durant was his time's Elon Musk, charismatic, risky, unpredictable, and his vanished palace reminds us the market has no loyalty. It can lift you to the heavens in 1920 and smear you across the asphalt in 1929. Assets can evaporate. Houses can be demolished. Only what actually works will remain. But there's another more intimate layer. Durant's fate raises ambition's price question. Was the General Motors empire worth losing peace and home? Looking at Billy's last years in Flint, in that very bowling club, we get an unexpected answer. It seems it was precisely the fall from Olympus that made him human. If Durant had died in 1920 at glory's zenith as Raymer's owner, he'd have remained in memory as a cold-blooded capitalist shark. But he lived long enough to lose everything and show his true essence. He proved dignity doesn't depend on housing square meters. He showed one can fry hamburgers with the same grandeur as signing transnational corporations' mergers. In the bowling alley, he was happier than in his palace's throne room. William Crapo Durant is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. His mausoleum is modest, especially compared to the castle he was building in Deal. But people don't come here for the architecture. They come to pay tribute to sacred madness, that very quality that makes a person bet everything, including the roof over his head, for faith in the future. This drama's final image isn't ruins. It's a sound, not the sound of breaking stone with which we began. It's a working engine's sound. Every time you turn the ignition key in your car, somewhere in the ether, Billy Durant's quiet laugh is heard. He lost all his money. He lost all his homes. He was ousted from his own company. But look out the window. The world you see is the world built according to his blueprints. The Raymer Mansion was just an expensive decoration. Billy Durant's real temple became the road, and this temple cannot be destroyed. History took away his stone from him, but gave him eternity. And for a man who always looked only forward, this was the only acceptable exchange.